All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. Tonight's informational session, we're going to do a walkthrough of the rules and regulations. Some of this information is a repeat from one of our fall info sessions, but we're hoping to spend a bit more time, especially if there's any questions that anybody has going into the national finals. So hopefully everybody's familiar at this stage in the competition season, but especially if you're new to STEM racing at this point in the year, what are the rules and regulations? So when we say rules and regs, we're referring to the competition rules and the technical regulations. It's important to note that these change every competition year. So that's going to change starting in like May, June timeframe. So make sure that you're always referring to the current rules for that season. So if you're watching this recording in the future, make sure it might look a little different than what I share on screen tonight, that you're referring to your current rules. Ultimately, the rules define everything, how competition's going to work, entry into competition, what you're going to turn in, how the points are awarded, what you can lose points for. So it's incredibly important that everybody understands the rules. And the top scoring teams at any competition consistently are the ones that know the rules the best and are able to follow them, and therefore the judges are able to award them the most points. So when we talk about where to find the rules, in the team portal, there's a rules and regulations tab, and you can scroll down to the development class or the professional class section. And again, you'll find those technical regulations and the competition rules. First, we're going to step through some competition regulations. I'm going to mostly cover tonight the professional class competition regulations because they're pretty identical to the development class with a few small changes that we'll try and highlight as they come up. So what's going to be inside? You've got 13 different articles that are going to define different parts of the competition. Again, the competition regulations are all about telling you what's going to happen in each section. So what are you going to have to turn in? For instance, with design and engineering, what are the judges looking for? How is the interview going to work? How is the portfolio supposed to be formatted? All of those kinds of questions are down in each section. At the end, you're going to find an appendix. It's going to have the scorecards along with a few other items in it that are very important, so don't skip on that one either. It's important to know everybody on your team should know, especially the competition regulations, backwards and forwards. Like I said, they define all parts of the competition, so if you don't know your rules, you don't really know what you're competing for or how you're competing. So when you go to a competition, make sure that everyone has a copy of those rules, or at least you have maybe one physical copy that's carried around with the team, or an easily accessible downloadable copy, whether it's on your phone or on your computer, something that if a situation comes up, you can quickly refer to your rules if you have questions about how things are proceeding. Like I said, rules cover most of everything of how the competition will be run, and don't forget that appendix. And then also take note of the important due dates for online submissions that are going to be in there, as well as portfolio formatting. So before we go to the technical regulations, let's walk through those competition regulations really quickly. Said I'm going to bring up the professional class, but a lot of this is overlapping with the development class. So beginning of any of the rule books, you're going to find a large table of contents. Kind of cool. If you pull this up on your computer or your phone, you should be able to click on any of these links and it'll take you to that exact rule in the rule book. So if you don't want to have to scroll everything, you can just click on any of these links. But if we go down to the first section, you're going to find Article 1, and that's definitions. And that's really when we talk about any terms in the competition, some that might be new to you, such as parked firm. It's going to define what that is, which, for instance, for that one, it's the area of the track where the cars are being turned into, where the judges take care of the cars during competition. So that's going to be that secure area. So some of these terms, that one might be a bit new to you, but other things, competition schedule, car race time, might feel like terms that are very common. You could probably assume what a competition schedule is going to be, but it's still important that you read through this, especially once, because the definition might be ever so slightly different than you expect, especially when it comes to things like car race time, for instance. The definition of it can prove an advantage if you find, different ways, or how the race time versus reaction time will come into play later in the rulebook when we talk about racing scoring and how that scoring is calculated. So if you're ever reading through later in the rulebook and you have a term, it's not a bad idea to flip back to C1 and just double check if that term has been defined. So all the articles, or all the definitions rather, it's pretty short in this first section. One thing I will highlight, and this affects only the professional class, is the engineering drawings. So you'll find a definition for it in the development class as well about what the engineering drawings are that you're going to be turning in. But this year for the professional class, the drawings also, they must have the mandated table of contents that's going to be found in Appendix 1 for the professional class. And we'll touch on what that one is later, but it's essentially 14 pages, must match exactly in that order and in that content as laid out in Appendix 1. So, like I said, that's required for the professional class this year. Development class, it's not required this year, but it's not a bad idea if you're getting started to flip to the professional class rulebook to that appendix and just get an idea of what's going into their rules or their engineering drawings, and it might provide some inspiration about how to format or lay out yours. It likely will get implemented next year in development class. All right, so Article 1 is definitions. Article 2, general information. Again, things you might be familiar with. So we're going to say, like, each team is 3 to 6 members. Should already know that if competing in the competition. But we also have some specific things. So we don't want to skip this section. C1 or C2.1 is really going to define what a team is. So 6 members, can't have, or if you have affiliated students, they have to have different uniforms. C2.2, we're going to talk about the actual competition program. So that's going to be issued closer to a competition. It's going to come out. It's going to talk a little bit about each team. It's going to have your team IDs in it if you haven't seen that already. And it's going to detail the schedule for the event as well. It's important as well when you're forming your team names that you abide by C2.2.2 and 2.2.3. You don't want to wait until you get to registration for us to have to ask you to change your name at that point. You can't have certain F1 trademarks in the name or these limited characters because they will end up racing or messing with the race system. So we'll have to remove them from your name. Team responsibilities, what we're covering tonight, covering the technical regulations and the competition regulations. So understanding and knowing those documents. Like I said, we'll step through everything to know how to use them to your advantage. But it's also your responsibility to ensure that your team members are at the correct location and time for scheduled activities. So that means being on time for an interview, being on time for race sessions. If you are late, it's not something that we're able to accommodate at a physical competition, especially. So that is the team's responsibility to be where you need to be on time. The race for a Formula One weekend doesn't get delayed if the team's not there. It still starts at the start time. The same thing. It's also your responsibility at a physical competition, especially to the security of your pit display items. So these are kinds of things. Let's say you have an interactive element, so an iPad or a computer at your pit display. You're ultimately responsible for the security of those items. So we always recommend at nationals that at least one of your members is there outside of judging events. So somebody also to talk to if guests come up to the display to ask questions, but for the security of your items. And if you do go back to your hotel rooms at the end of the night, those are items that you could take with you. So they're locked in your hotel rooms and secure. The ballroom does get locked, but just the kind of disclaimer there. It talks about roles and responsibilities of the supervising adult and their prevention. They can't obviously go into interviews or anything like that with you or interact in the judging process. C2.5 is going to be the same in both the tech regs and the competition regs, and that's just a restatement of what the competition regs are. So that's this document. Anything in this document you're going to find has a C prefix. So oftentimes if you ask us about a rule, we're just going to email you back and say, hey, look at C.2.5. And you'll know from the C that it's a competition reg. If it has a T, it's a technical regulation. We talk about interpretation of the rules. This mostly comes into play in international competitions, but the interpretations are in English. That being said, we've had certain teams that look up the formal Oxford English Dictionary definition of a word and are able to use that to their advantage for certain rules if you're getting really into the fine details of it. So I encourage you to always think outside the box, especially when you're reading these rules, and how could you interpret them maybe different, but still within the bounds of the regulations. 2.7 refers to supplementary competition regulations, and what that's going to mostly highlight is before any competition, Typically a pit display document will get released before a physical competition, and that's going to define specifically what that pit display is going to be. So down to the inch, where is the power outlet in your display? What is the size, down to the millimeter of the display itself. So broadly, everybody's told to prepare for 8 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. But once we get to our specific venue for a specific competition, that changes an inch or two kind of thing. So that's released in the supplementary document before the competition itself. So always be on the lookout for those. There generally won't be a lot, and they will be emailed out to the team manager and the adult. Design ideas. So this one talks about seeking clarification. You always, of course, can email us with questions or come to a session like this with questions. But you're not permitted to seek official rulings. So for instance, you can't email a picture of your car and be like, hey, is this wheel legal? We won't be able to make a ruling like that. In a case like that, we'll just tell you to refer to the wheel regulations. Also in C2, we've got some information on team partnership, so what defines a partnership. And most importantly, that I'm going to highlight in this section is C2.10. So 2.10 is going to define all of the items that are required for your team to compete at a competition. So we have the elements for regionals, which I'm going to kind of skip over since that was mostly last semester, and highlight nationals, for instance. So going to a national finals, your team is going to need to prepare, emphasis on the word prepare, 2 STEM racing cars, including your optional replacement components, a display car for use in the judging events, 1 fully machined, unfinished STEM racing model block, so that's for inspection by the judges, 1 unfinished manufactured halo for inspection by the scrutineering judges, 2 copies of your design portfolio, 2 copies of your enterprise portfolio, 2 copies of your project management portfolio, your pit display, your verbal presentation, a hard copy of those engineering drawings and renderings, a digital copy of your team's logo, a laptop containing all your data, and a project submission checklist. Now, I emphasize the word prepare with this section because obviously, as you might assume, you're not going to physically turn in a laptop to us at competition. You're not going to physically turn in your verbal presentation. You're going to give that presentation. And you're not going to turn in your display card to us either. So this list in C2.10 is a list of everything that you can think of as a to-do list for your national finals. When you leave your school and come to nationals, what should you have prepared at that point? And it's all of these items. C2.10.1, 2, 3, all through all those subsequent items. Those are going to detail each of those above on that list. So, hey, what specifically is the car? What specifically is the portfolio? It also talks about your online submission deadlines. But I'm going to skip ahead for a second here. You're going to find in C2.12 a submission list for project elements. And so if we scroll down to the national finals, that's where suddenly we're going to see, hey, there's a digital submission for some of those items that were mentioned in the list 2.10. And there's a physical list for some of the items mentioned in 2.10. But you'll notice not all the items that were in 2.10 are here. Because, for instance, like I said, you're not turning in your pit display, you're not turning in your verbal presentation, but you should have those prepared. So as a team, when you're reading through the rules and you're kind of making that to-do list of things that you need to prepare for nationals, make sure you refer to not only C.2.12, because that's the one that everybody, I think, goes to very quickly, but 2.10. And the items that most teams tend to forget are these 3 right here. So your display car, when you come to a physical competition, you don't need to bring it to check-in or anything like that. We're going to expect that you have a car that matches your 2 race cars, that it's going to be present in your pit display, on display for the other teams to see. Because when you turn in your 1 and 2 cars, those are going to be on the racetrack. They're not available for other teams to see. If you want to take, for instance, a car in your verbal presentation or in your enterprise presentation, you won't have your official race car to do so with. So that's why we require the use of a display car for judging events. It's important to note that display car is not scrutineered. It is not scrutineered. It is never taken and inspected by the judges, but it should be outwardly identical to your cars. You'll find hey, it's not going to race down the track. So if you can go with cheaper bearings or something for your display car, or maybe it's the heaviest car body that you've produced, or the wheels that didn't meet spec but are just a millimeter under. Those are the kinds of parts that you can use for your display car where they need to look like your final car. But if you have any of those elements that haven't passed your inspection or aren't quite perfect or a little cheaper, that's the place to put it, is on that display car. So keep that in mind, a way to save a little bit of funding there. The other two things that a lot of teams forget is the machinable car body. So that's going to be one foam block for the professional class that comes right off the mill. In the development class, if you've 3D printed your car, that's straight off the 3D printer, no modifications. Don't sand it, don't do anything to it. The judges want to see it right as it's come off the mill. And the same thing with the halo. And those are going to be used during the scrutineering process if any questions come up, but also during the design and engineering judging when they assess your quality of manufacturing and your quality of like CNC and additive and CAM and all of that. So make sure you don't forget those two items. As well, your team's logo is going to get turned in during registration. And then that project submission checklist, that's going to be found in your appendix. That's something that your team has to print and bring to competition. We'll send out several reminders with that as well, but you don't want to forget it. All right, so I've harped for a while on C2, so I'm going to skip through a lot of these items. A lot of them define very specifically how the format needs to be for a lot of documents, especially, I'm going to highlight here, when you submit your portfolios or any of your digital elements, there's a specific naming convention that you need to follow. Please follow that. If you don't, we can impose a penalty because we have to manually go change it so that make sure that it gets to the judges in the correct amount of time. So there's a page limit, there's a file limit, there's a name convention. Make sure you match all those formats when submitting your documents. So I'm going to skip through the rest of those for C2. Some other things to highlight. Project elements retained by STEM Racing. So if you're not part of the top 3 teams in an area, specifically for design and engineering, project management, or enterprise, you'll actually get your portfolios and everything you turn into us back. So when you turn in, you have to prepare, like I said, prepare 2 portfolios. You'll turn one in physically to the judges. The other set you'll bring to check-in for us to put a sticker on, and then you'll have to place it at your pit display. So you'll have to have a copy of all of those portfolios at your pit display, but you don't need to make an extra copy. Just bring 2 copies. One will be for the judges, one will be for your pit display. And if you don't score in the top 3 for those categories, you will actually get your portfolio back to take home with you. Same thing with your cars as well. Spirit of the competition and plagiarism, fairly straightforward. Be a good competitor, and don't copy other teams' works. We do plagiarism check and AI check all of the documents when they're turned in, just as a heads up. All right, competition format. So this is going to break down again how each competition works, how everything works. So there's interviews, judging streams, the different categories. I'm going to skim through a lot of this because each individual article talks about each of these 6 categories in further detail. And the scorecards we'll touch on at the end. This is a great chart when you sit down with your team and try and assess what to focus on for a competition. These is ultimately the total breakdown for your team. So out of a national finals, there's 1,000 points to be scored. Big highlight here on specifications. Specifications, everybody walks into the competition with 100 out of 1,000 points in their bucket. And you lose points if you break any of your technical regulations. And then you gain points in all of the other areas as long as you are able to present that information to the judges. So specifications is always one we highlight. That's something you can check at home before you even get to a competition. Hopefully you come in and with those 100 and you stay with those 100. But you can see here, enterprise is 100 points, engineering is 180 points. So the car and the racing is ultimately 200 and some odd points, and it's important, but everything else makes up that total picture. So when you choose what to focus on, if you only have limited time, maybe use that as a helpful area. Something to highlight, if a judge, or there's three sections of technical regulations. And they're defined here and they're repeated again in the technical regulation document when we get to it. But there's general safety and performance. So for an in-person competition, if you break a safety regulation, you will not be allowed to race your car. And nobody wants to see a team get all the way to competition and not be able to race their car. We do offer a 20-minute car fix session where if you have broken a safety regulation, we give you an opportunity to try and fix it so that you're able to race. But I will warn you, 90% of the safety regulations are near impossible to fix by the time you get to competition, because they are things that fundamentally have to be designed into your car. So please, please, please make sure you check your car for those safety regulations at a minimum before you head off to a competition, before you even cut your car in the CNC. All right, so like I mentioned, there are 6 competition areas we saw in the last article, C3, and then articles C4 through, I believe, so C4 through C8 are going to define those physical items that we're kind of turning in, counting the verbal presentation as a physical item. And then we'll talk about racing. So I'm going to go through the first one in detail, the first 2 in detail. Specification judging. So specification judging is once you physically turn your 2 cars into us and all those optional replacement components. The list of replacement components is listed here. We're going to go through and scrutinize them against the technical regulations. So each document is going to be laid out in what will be judged. So for this, it's going to be your 2 cars, as well the engineering drawings, renderings, and the quality of fit and finish will be assessed. Team preparation. So what do you have to do before you get there? Ensure that your cars and the components are complete and they're ready to go. You're going to submit that to us along with the drawings. Nobody attends. So who needs to attend? That's going to be nobody. You turn it in. No one can supervise. And then it'll outline actually what's going on with the judging process. So once the cars are in our hands, it's not this black box of mystery of what's going on. It's laid out right here. So like I said, you start with that full allocation of 100 points. Anything infringed deducts from that. So the judges scrutiny of the cars. They use manufactured gauges that broadly check for compliance. So we have, for instance, for overall length, we have a gauge that has the maximum, has the minimum. We kind of push that by the car. As long as the car's significantly within bounds, it's good to go. If it gets close to the boundary of that, that's when we're going to break out those accurate measuring tools. We have calipers, we have different things at our disposal to make sure that it's within the dimensional limits. And we go through every single technical regulation for that. We have different gauges for everyone, and we check for compliance. One of the things I want to mention when I talk about gauges, since we're on that topic, actually, if you haven't seen it before, on the team portal, underneath the download section, you scroll down about halfway on the page, you can actually download the exact gauges that we use in the scrutineering session and laser cut them or 3D print them at your school and test your car with them before you come to competition. So you'll see them at competition, but by then, like I said, it's a little too late to fix anything or change anything. But if you go to the team portal, you can actually download the gauges, print them yourself, anything like that to check. You always can do it with just a caliper too. There's a whole info session breaking down that. But so, like I said, it talks through as well, how are we going to assess the engineering judges? How's the interview work? So there's a specific period at nationals where you actually sit down with the lead scrutineer and they're going to step you through what rules you might have broken and give you an opportunity to talk through them with them. I mentioned those safe to fix rules. So like I said, it's oftentimes all safety rules, and the majority of them are things that it's near impossible to fix once you're at competition. So make sure at a minimum that you're compliant with these. And then it talks about appeals. So the biggest thing from the scrutineering section to make sure you pay attention to is the list of optional components. You want to give yourself an opportunity if something breaks at competition to replace it. If you don't turn it into us, we can't replace with it. And then these safe to fix rules. So those are the 2 biggest things to remember from that section. Articles 5, 6, and 7 focus on your portfolios. So for development class, since we're reviewing a professional class right now, you're only gonna have two, and that's gonna be your design and engineering, and then your enterprise and project management portfolios. Professional class has three, so a little different, but pretty much the same content. Like I said, we're gonna start with that format. What will be judged? Each of these has the little sections that are gonna be assessed in both the portfolio and the interview. So in preparing for this section, you're gonna create a portfolio. You're also gonna need to have that laptop ready to take to the design and engineering interview. So as we mentioned in C 2.10, the items that you have to be prepared to bring to a competition is that laptop with the CAD and everything on it. You're gonna have to bring that to your design and engineering interview so that the judges may ask you, hey, we would love to see your CAD feature tree and talk through that with you. That may be an area they assess. As a reminder, the design and engineering judges only have access to the engineering portfolio. So if there's something that you talked about in your enterprise portfolio, the judges aren't going to see that. They aren't going to know it even exists. We mentioned taking that display card to the design and engineering judges. So if you want to highlight anything on your car, hey, this is our wheel, this is what it looks like, and you don't have a display piece, you might want to take that display car. You're also welcome to bring extra pieces in. So if you have a wing that has a really cool feature to it, let's say you print it 3 times the scale, so it's much bigger and easier to see, and you bring that to your design and engineering portfolio or interview. You're allowed to bring those kinds of props as well to talk through. Again, it's an interview, not a presentation, but you can be prepared with some things. Make sure that you've read the scorecard and it'll discuss the items that they're looking for. Who needs to attend? So at a minimum, the session has to be attended by the team manager and the design team and the manufacturing engineers. We recommend that the whole team's there just as from a learning perspective. And you'll see when we talk about interviews later on, how does the whole team get involved, be actively participating? Well, maybe your graphic designer is holding all that those props I talked a minute ago, the extra pieces. And so when your design engineer starts talking about something, your graphic designer shuffles through the box and pulls it out and is able to hand it to them. So they're able to focus on talking to judges and you can just be prepared with those items, those kinds of things. This talks about the judging process. So the teams will be awarded points per their key performance indicators. So those are the items talked about above, shown in the design and engineering scorecard as well. They'll review the portfolio after you turn it in to us digitally, and then as well once you turn it in physically at competition, before your interviews. And they use that to gauge those initial points. And then once you go into your interview, they're trying to nail down kind of that range of points you've been placed in. So one of the things we always have to say is make sure you document it in your portfolio, because even if you have the nothing documented in your portfolio, but you talk about it and it's a total 20 out of 20 in your interview, we still have to judge all the teams fairly. So you would get scored lower because there's nothing on it in your portfolio. So it's important to highlight that because the judges are assessing that before judging begins for a large portion of the points. The quality of car manufacturing and assembly will be judged separate. So again, that'll happen reviewing that piece that you submit during registration and the unmanufactured halo. And then some of that also happens actually on the scrutineering side. Your portfolio. You'll find a similar format for this paragraph in the development class portfolio or regulation. So I want to highlight that. But the green versus the blue text, incredibly important. We had a few teams that mix this up for regionals. For nationals, you're going to be preparing a hard copy 11-page portfolio. So it's a 1-page cover, and the only thing on your cover really is your team logo, the name of the portfolio, maybe some sponsors, no content, no table of contents, no paragraphs, anything like that. It becomes constituted as a page of content. No content on the front cover, just what the cover is. And then 10 pages of content. So make sure when you're looking through all the regulations, and it's slightly different for the development class, that you have the page numbers correct for what you're turning in. We had some teams turn in too many pages, some teams turn in too few. Make sure that you're turning in the right number of pages and that it's the right size. So your portfolios are going to be 11 by 17. And one side note is you're turning in that hard copy. So you might be able to infinitely zoom on a digital copy of a portfolio like regionals and zoom in to read the text or to read a small image. I'd recommend printing off a copy before you get to nationals, so, and seeing if people can read the size text you have, things like that. But like I said, they're looking for that content related to those items above. Now, because of time, I'm gonna skim through these other sections because they're similar. For instance, everything project management, we're gonna talk about different KPIs, but same kind of thing. You're preparing a portfolio, you're turning in the portfolio, the judges are assessing the portfolio. The team member type does change for PM, so all team members must go to the project management session. And your page numbers might change, so the quantity of pages, but that size is gonna remain the same. Enterprise, again, the KPIs are changing, so what are we looking for in this section? Team preparation is the same, you're preparing your enterprise portfolio. Also in enterprise, you have your pit display, so we're gonna get to that in a quick second. When it comes to your interview, all team members must be present. For your engineering and your project management interviews, those are gonna be in separate rooms at a physical competition, but your enterprise interview is gonna actually take place at your pit display. So any of the elements that you kind of have prepared will come from your pit display itself. The procedure is slightly different because it's at your pit display. So team members, when the judges first come at your pit display time, they might ask you to step back for a second and say, hey, we want to just look at your pit display for 1 to 2 minutes. Let us read through all the information you have, get familiar, and then they might start asking you questions. So that's a little bit different, as that kind of different structure than walking right into an interview and starting right on time. The judges will read through everything. In addition, they are going to be reviewing your enterprise portfolio ahead of getting to your pit display. So that's where, when you've talked about your pit display design process, that has to be documented up here in your engineering portfolio, or in your enterprise portfolio, sorry. They're going to be looking at all of that before they get to your interview itself. And then same thing, your enterprise portfolio requirements. So we talked about the size, the number of pages, make sure we're paying attention to that. Listed again here what the contents are. Enterprise talks about it in a bit more detail than some of the other sections. Pit displays. So for your national finals, obviously if you're watching this for the regional finals, it'll be all digital and there's a template to follow. But for the national finals, this is where, when I talked about earlier, that supplemental document that'll get released that has specific dimensions. So your display space is typically 3 meters by 1 meter by 2.4, which is standard, but the precise specifications are released in that supplementary document. And that's where we're going to say, hey, here's where the outlet is going to be. Here's how much power you're given specifically. You're going to have 2 hours to set it up. This will be stuff, you know, that's also talked about in supplementary, but that stays the same. Any teams that don't complete it, this is where you can get penalized if you haven't fully cleaned up all of the trash in your area. And then all of these rules are very important for the pit display itself. So no part of the display is allowed to protrude beyond the physical limits. So if we've got flags, projections, anything like that, that would be imposed penalty. We would ask you to put that back inside the area or just turn it off. Only team members are allowed to set up the displays. So no lead adult, support members, anything like that, unless it's deemed to be a safe and health and safety issue. So you'll want to practice perhaps putting up your display once or twice at your school before you actually come to a national, so that you know you can set it up within that 2-hour time limit. And you kind of have a practice with it. The judges might ask you to turn something down. If it's very loud, you have a super loud video or something that might be distracting. The pit displays, keep in mind, are going to be in the same ballroom as racing. So if you have something that's throwing off a lot of lights and being very loud, they might find that's a distraction to the racing event, and they might ask you to turn it down slightly. Any electrical appliances attached to the power supply must be safe. Like I said, that comes out in the supplementary document a lot of what that power is. All pit display items must be hand carried. So teams can't ship items to national finals. They have to carry that into the event. And then there's some recommendations. This actually aligns with like the cargo hold of an airplane where you would put it in. But all of these things, So as we kind of go through the rules are important. The biggest ones to pay attention to for fit display are making sure you're in the constraints of the display itself, that you've hand carried those items, and that at the end of that 2 hour limit that you're completely cleaned up and you have all your trash with you. Those are typically the biggest ones that we find issues with. This is a picture of an example like display setup that you'll be given. There's typically the option to reserve a table. There's a form that'll come out and say, hey, do you want a table to be in there? Do you want it to be left open blank so you don't have to bring a table to competition? So keep that in mind when designing your display. And then once it's fully set up, what it might look like, nothing protruding, nothing going outside the display or anything like that. All right, so C8, other rules, follows the same kind of structure again. What's going to be judged for the verbal presentation? What kind of KPIs are we looking for? Preparation, obviously putting your presentation together, who has to attend, it's the full team, and then how the actual structure of it works. So they're going to start with your timer, they're going to run it for 10 minutes, they're going to give you a warning 1 minute when it remains, some kind of flashcard or something held up, and that will be explained to you before you start your presentation. And then as soon as the 10 minutes stops, the presentation stops. They will cut you off, they will make you stop, there's no running over time, it will stop immediately at 10 minutes. And then there will be some time for clarifying questions afterwards if they feel that's necessary. Important to highlight, something that we always get a question about is there will be a standard system, whether that's a TV or a projector or something in the room with you for the verbal presentation, and a standard HDMI-A connection will be provided. So if you have an HDMI-C or a USB-C port connection, make sure you have an adapter that you have to bring on your own. So standard HDMI-A connection should be able to be plugged into your device in order to project. Racing. A lot of questions come up with racing, which is why the racing section is so long. And I know sometimes this section can be complicated to read through and a bit tedious, but it's going to define what kind of racing happens at each finals, whether that's a regional or national finals, how you prepare. So making sure that you're familiar with the driver start system, how the car is going to get staged, how the car is going to run. So it's going to step you through everything in there. I'm going to kind of skip a lot of this because it is so long. It goes through quite literally step through steps. Okay, the race order is going to be shown. A team member is going to be asked to take place at the end of the track. The judge is going to turn the safety on. The safety is going to be disabled once it's set up. All of these kind of steps. And it also displays the formulas for how racing points are calculated. So the other sections of the regulations, the portfolio and the verbal presentation have a scorecard that directly contributes. We'll look at in a second here. But racing follows a point-based formula based off the times. Same thing with knockout. It's going to talk about how all that's totaled, how knockout works, any points on that, does not finish, false starts, track 10 lines is done. I'm skipping through a lot of this for the sake of time, but if you do have any questions specifically on it, we can talk about it during Q&A. Car repairs and servicing. So there's time that's allowed for you to physical competition, and this is going to detail exactly how long you have with penalty, without penalty, and car servicing. Protests. So if you do feel something was unfairly done, or you want to register a formal complaint, that can be done at a competition. This talks about the judges. So we talked about those 6 panels earlier, which correspond to 6 different sections or 6 different articles in the rules. Each of those is a different panel of judges from industry experts and experienced alumni. And this just talks a little bit about that, and then the awards that are up for grabs for all the competitions. All right, so pretty long document, but we've made it through so far pretty quickly here at 30 minutes or so, a little over. And then we're going to talk about the appendix really quick before we get back to our presentation. So I mentioned this at the beginning. It is mandatory for the professional class this year. It is not required or talked about in the development class, but I'd recommend if you're a development class team to at least look at this. It's a good place to start when you're developing your drawings. The engineering drawings and renderings must comprise of, or engineering drawings must comprise of these 14 pages in this order with these items. So you need to have a cover page, you need to have a table of contents, you need to have an orthographic drawing, an exploded view with your bill of materials, all of these items. If you're putting all of these items together and you're putting them in this order and you're putting them with the, everything that it talks about on here, I can guarantee you'll get points. And get some more points than some teams, because we had a lot of teams that didn't follow this format for competition in the past. And they were missing out on points, and that's why we've kind of released this year. We want to see all of these elements, and so we've tried to detail it and step it out for each team. So have all these elements, and it will immediately help improve your points there. This is an awards matrix that if you're interested where the points come from to determine who gets the best team identity, for instance, it'll show you where on the scorecards the points determine who's the winner. And then we go through our individual scorecards. So hopefully if you're at the stage in the competition, or if you're getting new, you'll hear us harp 1,000 times on the scorecards are incredibly important. The judges for each section are only given the article which responds to them, or which pertains to them, and then the scorecard which pertains to them, and then your materials that you've done for that section. So for instance, scrutineering, they'll only be given your engineering drawings and renderings and your cars and the rules, and that's what they go with. So as you develop your materials, you want to make sure that you have all of the elements that are based in these scorecards. And like I mentioned, specifications, you start off with 100 and lose them because of penalties, but everything else, imagine yourself starting at 0 or 1 and building up from there. So do you have everything in this column? Yes, no. Do you have everything in this column? Yes, no. All of that. And it has to be of quality, and that's what determines the points. But at a minimum, if you don't have it, it will prevent you from, we call it, moving up the band. So it details everything. You'll notice these KPIs. So those KPIs we talked about, like in Article C5, that design concepts is here. And now it breaks out what specifically that KPI looks like. Same thing. KPI, KSIs, they're all here. Same thing for enterprise, for engineering, project management. So big detailed scorecard, lots of things in here. The easiest thing I recommend is to print off a copy and take like a yellow highlighter and highlight those kind of items. You know, here we've got regular status reports. Okay, so somewhere in my project management portfolio, hopefully under a section titled monitoring and control, I should have something that talks about status reports. It's a really good idea to use the word status reports, so it makes it very bold that that's there. So highlight that and highlight, okay, I need to talk about scope creep. Okay, I need to talk about detailed tracking processes. And when you're developing your content for your portfolios, you'll find if you just make a list of those like 3 bullets or however many bullets for each KPI, and you just write a sentence or 2 about each of those, you'll fill most of your portfolio if you're struggling for any content. Your pit displays build assessment scorecard. So this corresponds to the enterprise section we talked about earlier, but things such as, did you have hand carried freight? Did you complete it within the setup time? Does your display protrude? This is a different restating. I think this is like the exact terminology to be specific, but some of it expands. This is where you can lose those points. So if you do lose points, you'll receive one of these. Your verbal presentation scorecard, same thing like everything above. And then your specification scorecard. This is the only one in your competition regulations that'll look a little different because it's going to match your technical regulations. So each technical reg, the T prefix, a brief summary of what it is, and then the penalty associated with that. And this is what the scrutineers use to award points for your, or remove points from your car. If you competed at the regional finals and submitted a car, you'll be getting one of these back that's been filled in by the judges. And so you should be able to see exactly what rule you lost points on, and oftentimes with the note on what area of the car they measured it in. So before you get to competition, I'd recommend, especially with all of your scorecards, printing out a copy. Like I said, highlighting those areas so you know what to build with your portfolios, but then also right before you're ready to go, maybe a month out or a few weeks out, print a copy of your portfolio where you're at, print a copy of these regulations or these scorecards, and hand them off to an English teacher, hand them off to a parent, hand them off to a sponsor or somebody, and have them review it for you and let them see from an outsider's perspective what they would give you. And it might be a bit more generous or a bit more harsh because they're not an official judge, but it's going to give you an indication of areas where you might be weak in, or things that, hey, you had those status reports for project management, but you never talked about them, so they couldn't find it in the portfolio, so they scored you lower. And that's helpful feedback, especially when it comes to scrutineering your car. Cannot emphasize enough, make sure you have a legal car. This talks through a flow chart of all the racing procedure, because that's a pretty long section. This is it in a bit easier visual format. And then your car submission and your project submission checklist. So this is what you'll have to print and bring to your check-in at a national finals. And this again has all of those elements that you're going to turn into us. Not that you have to prepare, but that you have to actually physically turn in. So you'll bring 2 portfolios, you'll bring your drawings, you'll bring your car, all of that gets checked off. And then I think the last part of the appendix here is that fit display template that everybody should have used for the regional finals. So a bit long, but I mean, we skipped a little bit of stuff. We skimmed a little bit of stuff there, but we made it through in just, I think, like 40 minutes for the competition regulations. I'm not going to step through in as much detail the technical regulations because we have some other presentations on it. And if we get through the rest of this PowerPoint, we'll go through them. But like I said, it's important to make sure that you go through those as a team, you go through those individually. I know it takes time, but in an hour or two, you can kind of go through them. Technical regulations, like I said, we'll try and come back to this if we have time at the end of this presentation, but it's built up on the same thing. Composition breaks out the different parts of the portfolio that your portfolios and elements that you're turning in. This breaks out the different parts of the car. And despite its name, everybody should read technical regulations at least once. So even if you're a graphic designer, read it at least once. Obviously, your engineers, you should be reading these multiple times, especially leading up to competition, at least 3 times that you've read it. And talk about the rules. It's never a bad idea to just have a random meeting and hey, let's chat about the rules. Anybody, even if you want to break it down in more manageable pieces, everybody read this technical section and this competition article. So it's just one article, one the other. It's like 4 pages to read and have a discussion as a group. Look for those loopholes. Like I said, you can look at plain English definition of a word, or how can you think outside the box? How can you gain a competition advantage? I mentioned earlier, like I said, the judges have access to one area and they can't award points that they don't have values for. So I'm not saying you should do only what's on the scorecard, but give attention really to those scorecards when you sit down to develop your portfolios or sit down to develop your verbal presentation. Highlight those areas, use those as a framework for what to put in your portfolio or what to put in your presentation. Because it's great if you have other things, but if you haven't covered those basics, the judges aren't going to be able to give you points. All right, so the walkthrough we already went through for the competition regulations. Just kind of a brief summary. We've talked about use those KPIs that are in each section. So those listed articles here that correspond with the scorecard. So marketing and strategy materials, we've got that here, but then we have it further defined what that really means in the eyes of the judges. And so then where can you pull up those little tidbits about, okay, they want quality marketing, enhancing the cost of content, all of those kinds of things that you can further define what that means for your team and use that. Hey, we need a paragraph on sponsorship and marketing. There's sponsorship and ROI. Need at least some attention to digital media. We need sustainability. Incredibly good idea to take these and turn these into heading titles for your portfolios. You know, have a page on this, have a page on that, have a page on this, have a page on that. So the judges can very quickly find where's your sustainability information, where's your ROI information, because you have a whole page or a whole section on that page dedicated to it. It's got a big header. You can't miss it. It's right there. They'll read through all of your portfolio. And like I said, they'll have those digital copies ahead of competition to look at and those physical ones as well. But the judges are often judging up to 20 teams at a time. And so the more you can do to make it obvious and make it easier for them to find it, the easier it is for them to award you points for it. And then from there, it's what can you do to stand out. So when you have your rules before competition, everybody, if you're just starting out, but most of the teams on this call tonight, you've been around. You should have read the rules. During competition, have those meetings about the rules, reread them, return to them. Team managers, I encourage you highly to, like I said, pick an article, pick a technical regulation section and say, hey, before our meeting this week, we're gonna take 5 minutes or 10 minutes to just talk about these rules. So make sure everybody's read them when you come to the meeting. It'll take you 5 minutes on the bus on your way to school. And then right before competition, return to those rules again, especially when you talk about the sections that say like, what's an interview gonna look like? What do we need to bring into the interview? And then especially those scorecards as well. Can we print off copies and have people review it? Can we print off the scrutineering spec sheet and spec our car? Talk about a lot of the common mistakes as they came up. So I'm kind of going to skip this slide. The biggest thing in general that people don't do is they don't like read those scorecards. They don't give the judges opportunities to award those points. And ultimately, they just don't know the rules. And it's very obvious to teams that haven't read the rules and think they know what's going on with competitions. They develop materials that are good materials, but they're totally talking about something different than the judges can assess for, or it's completely different than a portfolio. So make sure that you're developing your target. If you were doing an essay for class, you're going to go to your teacher and ask, hey, how many pages does it need to be? Is there a font size, what spacing, all those kinds of things, and kind of understand what you're going in for, what, page size needs to be on. The regulations kind of lay out what size does it need to be, what needs to be in there to get a good grade. So how do you get the most points? So like I said, know your regulations. If you know them, I guarantee you will score more points. That's the single most biggest distinguisher between the top scoring teams and some of the teams that score lower than they would like. All right, I've got 6 minutes left, I think, technically on this call. So I'll open it up to see if you guys have any questions. If not, we can look at the technical regulations incredibly briefly. But this session was covered in the fall sessions, so there should be a technical walkthrough that happened. I think either last February or in September. So there's a recording in the portal for that as well, where we step through the tech regs really closely. But yeah, before I flip to those, any questions? All right, so I'll do a quick look at this. I'll try and stop right here at 8:30. So give ourselves 5 minutes, which is way too brief for the technical regulations. But like I said, this is an opportunity. Take those sections, split it up week by week, or hey, today on the bus ride, I'm going to read this. Today on the ride home, I'm going to read this. Similar to the competition regulations, there's a table of contents. All of these are hyperlinked, so you click on them and it'll take you right to the rule. You don't want to scroll forever. And then it does also highlight if they're performance, their penalty, or their general penalties, or if they're safety penalties. So all the ones in big, bold red, those are the ones I want to make sure that you pay extra attention to. And there's a lot in here. It is a lot. As many pages as you have of competition regulations to tell you how the entire competition works, we have that many pages to tell you just how the car works, which is a bit daunting. But if you read through them, a lot of them, for the most part, are fairly obvious. And so we've got, first of all, T1.1, and that's all the different parts of your car. So similar to how the different articles in the competition regulations break down what's in C2.10, all the different sections of your technical regulations are going to break down what's in T1.1. So your car has to have a body. In the professional class, it's going to be made out of foam. In the development class, it can also be 3D printed. A nose cone, a rear wing assembly, front wheels, including their support systems, rear wheels, tether line guides, surface finishing, so your decals or any colors, paint, your logo decal, a halo, and a driver's helmet. Beneath that, in C1, you're going to find definitions for each of those items that we just listed above. Some of them in more detail. So, for instance, you've got defining exactly what is body. It's going to be a solid, uninterrupted piece of that model block. All that terminology is incredibly important. Little things like an uninterrupted piece, people have lost points on where the block breaks, they glue it together. Well, now it's not technically uninterrupted, it has a seam between. So all of these very detailed but important. Wing, one common thing we see a lot of points lost on is a wing has to have, by definition, a leading edge and a trailing edge that it has. So it should be in here. Oh, yes. So required chord surface, including its features of a leading edge and a trailing edge. So you can see here, this is its leading edge, this is its trailing edge, and it kind of shapes back, it tapers. You can have a wing that does all kinds of shapes, but you can't have a rectangular feature be a wing. Emphasis on that. So if you have something that is a square shaped wing and it's not filleted, it's not rounded, it hasn't been kind of rounded off, technically has two edges at the front because there's four edges to a rectangular prism. Actually more than four, but four when looking at the side profile. So very important, kind of the wing terminology. How do we define a wing? Then later, we're gonna have a whole section on how we measure the wings. Nose cone, wheel support system, tether line guides, all of this. I would say T1 is a really important section. There's some things that we saw in C1 for the competition regulations, like a competition schedule. You're like, okay, yes, we know what a competition schedule is. It's going to be a list of interview times. We understand that. But T1 really gets into the nitty gritty of how do we define a wheel? And if you haven't got that baseline down and it's not technically a wheel by definition or a wing by definition, even when we get to the wing section of the technical regulations, you might be losing points because do you have that wing because it doesn't have a trailing edge. So it's important to make sure you spend time on this section. One thing, we see this missed all the time. The STEM Racing logo decal that you have to have on your car is used to identify your A car, your B car, and your display car. So like I said, you're preparing 3 cars for competition. Your A car and your B car race, your display car is on the pit display. And to help us identify those, they have 3 different decals. And so it's A, B, C. Or not really C, display. You should select the decals for your car that provide the most amount of contrast to the background color of your car. So there's this dark coded version, I'm going to say is the top row, and this light coded version is the bottom. And you can't see, but there is, so it's a 15 by 30 sticker. I think you might be able to open the image, you can see it, but there's a white border around this effectively. You want to choose what is the maximum contrast to your car. So say the 1 millimeter contrast border must be the maximum contrast. So it's not necessarily, oh, hey, we have a black car, so we want to put the black decal on it so it blends in more. You would lose points because really you should use the white decal, the white background decal, so that the edge of the decal is what has that most contrast. We want to be able to measure the side of the decal to make sure the decal is the right size. And that's what they're going to be looking for. All right. These decals also, if you don't have them, they're in the portal. Same place as the scrutineering gauges were earlier. You also can get them from Race to Learn if you don't want to print them yourselves, and they're like $3. They won't be provided at competition, so please make sure you have them. Engineering drawings, this goes through everything again. Again, make sure you refer to that appendix in the competition scorecard. It's like, some of these things are very small, and I mean, this is one line right here that if you kind of miss this line and you haven't also read your competition regulations, you could potentially miss this whole thing. So there's a lot in here, and we try and highlight the important things, but sometimes there's a lot to cover. Talk about the vertical reference plane A and reference plane B. These terms will come up later when we talk about measuring. For instance, your front wing has to be so far in front of your front axle center line, or can only be so far in front. of that reference plane and such. So all of these regulations, the halo has a detailed area. Talk about all that. T1 is what each specific element is. The general, similar to the other section where it breaks down points. We're gonna talk about the 3 categories, interpreting the rules in English. This prefix section, again, that mentioned that's gonna be the same. Compliance. It details performance penalties. So I mentioned if you don't pass those safety regulations, you won't be allowed to race. These performance regulations, if you miss them and you're 2 millimeters off. So I'm gonna say like this chart here is the easiest way to explain it. So the regulation is you have to be 50 millimeters or more. And it's -2 points per millimeter. If you're 49.9 to 49.0, so you're a little under, you're only gonna miss those 2 points. Not terrible, but it's still points. But if you're 46.0, that 2-point penalty is going to multiply each millimeter you're off. So you're going to get 2 points for being out here, 4 points there. 5. So in total, you're going to be 8 points because you're -2, -2, -2, -2 for each of those millimeters that you're off. And ultimately, 4 millimeters is very small. Like it's not a huge distance. It could be an easy mistake, but suddenly those performance penalties, and you're going to lose those points on each car. So for instance, if you had a rear wingspan and you were off at 46 versus 50, you're going to lose 8 points on your A car and 8 points on your B car. So now you're suddenly down 16 points, and that's just one regulation. And that's out of 100. So these performance penalties total up very quickly. So make sure that you're in compliance with those safety regs, and then the performance things are the next ones to check. And we're running out of time here, but the biggest ones we always see missed are the wings, because the span of the wings are so long sometimes, 1 or 2 millimeters. It's not easy to always see when you're a millimeter or 2 off on a big span, but when the judges measure it, it can total up to a lot of points. So the rest of the regulations, like I said, we went through this in a past info session if you want to see it in detail, but they talk about each specific part. They're going to go through generally each section. I would pause to say that this is also something that teams always forget, and it's 2 points. It's super easy. Just put your team number on the car. If you get to the point where you have to write it on your car in Sharpie, it's 2 points. 2 points is 2 points, and then again, it's your A car and your B car. So we always see that one kind of missed. But each section, like I said, is on those different areas that were listed in T1.1. So your CO2 chamber, tether line guides, which are all safety, all big ones, wheel support, and then we're going to go into your different wings, and then your rear wings, and then should get into additional components so that you can't have anything outside of T1.1. There's also an appendix, so that's going to detail track dimensions, the block dimensions. It has some examples of wings, wings that would pass, wings that would fail, winglets that would fail, winglets that would pass, both the front and rear. So this is really good to check yourself with if you have one of these. How are we measuring overlap? How are we measuring no overlap? And then dimensions on the halo and the other. It also has an example in here of how to identify parts for your engineering drawings. So when a judge has a question about, well, what are they defining about front wing or wing support or wheel support, they're going to go to your engineering drawings for that clarification. And so you can use colors like this team did. You can use different hashing. You can use different callouts, but tell us in some way that, hey, these right here, the winglets, that's what we want you to measure. Don't measure this other stuff, measure just this. If you don't tell the judges, it's up to their discretion, best guess, best what have you, and you ultimately will probably lose points because you're not telling them what to measure. So, this can be done in your CAD software, or you could bring it into another program and color it there or something else, but just try and have something. And if you have, there's also examples in the team portal of past engineering drawings. If you have questions, always reach out to us. And then this goes back to talks through identification of your halo and everything else. So I've run over time a little bit there, and I know it was super quick on technical regulations. We've had that common mistake slide. The biggest ones are often with wings, with the tether line guides, and with the numbers, and some of the decals on the car. I would say those are typically the ones that are missed the most. And especially with those wings being the performance penalties, they can really add up. But with that, that's kind of all the information I have for tonight. The recording of tonight's gonna get posted on the team portal if you wanna go back and review. But pretty much stepping through competition regulations, stepping through technical regulations. The biggest things to look for are just make sure that you've read it through and you have an understanding. Make sure you check it again before you go to competition, so you refresh your brain for all of that. And use those scorecards, use what you're given to help guide your project in terms of what information are we putting into the portfolio, what are we putting into the verbal, what are we doing for the car? And that's gonna, I guarantee you, get you so many more points, because you're automatically on the right track there. Before I close it out, any questions? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.